Today's conversation is on the appearances of mental influence and personal magnetism, which naturally arises by being. Naturally arises by being. What I mean by this is who you are is beyond the limitations in mind. And as we acknowledge that we are beyond the conditions placed upon consciousness in mind, as we continuously acknowledge that we are transcendent to the beliefs of limitation, the thoughts of limitation in mind, what happens is it naturally manifests as what we can call appearances of personal magnetism or mental influence, where it appears as physically through the five senses, as harmonious conversations, flow-based interactions. Even, I trust you notice this as well, people appearing to say the same thing at the same time you imagine. And also, they appear to say the same thing, let's say, differently. Yet as you have reconciled to acknowledge that pure being plays out in harmony, it is clearly understood what they're saying. And let's say if there was a third party observing the conversation, they would say, these two individuals seem to get along really well. They get along really well, even though they appear to be very different. Even though they appear to be from what we could say as different walks of life, have different interests, they appear to get along really well. That is a result of being. And by this I mean, practically speaking, over the years, what I have done is I have released the illusory conditions placed upon consciousness. And by this I mean very specifically is, let's say I was about to interact with someone, during interaction with someone, and after an interaction with someone. It was very apparent, and I trust you noticed this as well, it was very apparent when we put conditions on the other person, when we put conditions on ourselves, when we put conditions of how the relationship should be in order to experience, let's say, love, happiness, peace, bliss, fulfillment. And why those are conditions on consciousness, as I say, that are not needed, is what I notice is that as those conditions are released by not identifying with them, as those conditions don't belong to you, those conditions belong to what the Bible refers to as the former self or the old man. As these conditions are released in mind, what naturally flows is a harmonious conversation, a harmonious relationship, reality experienced perfectly as it is now. In other words, as I've been saying, and we mentioned this in Thursday's video, if you haven't seen it, I'll link in the description. Reality is in harmony. You are perfect as you are now. We can only, let's say, think that we are not, yet those thoughts don't belong to us. So we could say we can put off those former conversations, put off those former thoughts, which releases the conditions placed upon consciousness, and what manifests is what we could say the appearances of personal magnetism, the appearances of mental influence, such as, for example, what a person says, what a person doesn't say, what a person does, what they don't do, body language, voice tonality, all these things we could say that a person may try to acquire in order to be magnetic is realized to be a natural manifestation, an authentic manifestation through self-acceptance, unconditional self-acceptance. We could say a radical self-acceptance by simply releasing the conditions in mind placed upon consciousness, releasing the conditions in mind through what we can say are opportunities presented prior to the interaction, during the interaction, and after the interaction. So as I took those opportunities over the years, what I started to notice is that people came up to me and said, "You seem to be very comfortable in these kinds of conversations. In public speaking, you seem to flow. Things seem to be very easy. I really like how you responded to this particular person. How did you know what to say? Where did you learn that from?" And these things that I say or don't say, what I have found is a natural result. These appearances of what we can say are influential styles of communicating or statements that sound very persuasive or influential. These words, the body language, the voice tonality, etc., naturally arose. It happened naturally through releasing the conditions placed upon consciousness in mind. And those conditions, I acknowledge, are not authentic conditions. By that I mean, as I always say, you are everything that you desire to be. You have everything that you desire. You are love, happiness, peace, bliss, fulfillment. As you acknowledge that the fact that you exist is love, happiness, peace, bliss, fulfillment, everything that you desire, you acknowledge that you need nothing, and thus you don't try to control, force, manipulate another person. And what naturally manifests is what we can call appearances of mental influence or appearances of personal magnetism, which is true and authentic to you. And over the years, I've been teaching this because what I have found is in the earlier stages, I would try to mimic people to be more persuasive. I would read these various books and watch these various videos that would seem to suggest that I need to do this versus that in order to have a harmonious conversation with another person. In other words, if I did this, then it can be harmonious. If I did that, then it's not harmonious. Even though I have found that I have witnessed people doing this and the conversation was harmonious, doing that and the conversation was harmonious. See, no shame, no condemnation. That is a condition that suggests if you do this, then you can experience a harmonious relationship. You must do this in order to experience a harmonious relationship, harmonious conversation, etc. And if you don't do this, then you won't experience it. Well, what if we release that condition, which generates confusion? Because what I mean by that is in the earlier stages, I would stack these, and it would result in a very stifling kind of experience when I was interacting with a person. I would overthink what I was doing prior. because I thought I had to hit all these items on a checklist in order for the conversation to be harmonious. During the interaction even, I had to hit all these checklist items in order for this to be a harmonious conversation. After the interaction, I had to hit all these checklist items in order for the interaction to be considered influential or mutually harmonious. And that would generate a lot of overthinking in mind. It would generate a lot of confusion. And at a particular point, I stopped identifying with those kinds of dichotomous beliefs that it needs to be this way, then it works, and if it's not this way, then it doesn't work. I released it. And what I noticed was my natural style of communication manifest. I tend to communicate in my style. I tend to speak in my way. I tend to, let's say, manifest particular body language that is my style, voice tonality, etc., because I have, over the course, released these conditions in mind that belong to, again, what the Bible refers to as the old man. So it's not me really thinking, it's old man thinking. I release these conditions in mind, and pure consciousness is experienced as harmonious relationships. This is what I mean by the appearances of mental influence as a result of being, pure being as you are now. And that's it. That's what I did over the years as the opportunities presented themselves. One can call this thinking for yourself, really thinking for yourself. Because why I say that is, who is to suggest that you need to mimic someone, you need to copy someone, you need to do exactly what people say in order to be magnetic, in order to have harmonious relationships, which is the fruit of being? Why do you need to be someone else, let's say? You are perfect now. You are whole now. You are complete now for no reason at all. Not because, let's say, you have a lot of money in the bank account, you have a lot of dates, because people like your hair, because you're this tall, etc. If a person forms an identity around those appearances, let's say those appearances change, now they think that they're not magnetic, which is an illusion. That's just conditioning in mind. What I teach is release these conditions placed upon consciousness. And what naturally manifests is wonderful harmonious relationships and the appearances, the five sensory appearances. As this world is made visible through the five senses from imagination, you may see yourself communicating in a particular way, saying things, body language, etc. And it's your distinct style. And people may come up to you and say, how do you do it? They may say, what if I copy what you're doing? Will it work? And so my response to that is it may or it may not. I rather you accept yourself as you are and take these opportunities, let's say, prior to interaction. Anytime these illusory thoughts appear that suggest you are not love, happiness, peace, bliss, fulfillment, the other person is not love, happiness, peace, bliss, fulfillment, the relationship or the experience can't play out in a harmonious way that we could say falls within the categories of love, happiness, peace, bliss, fulfillment. Anytime these illusory thoughts appear in mind, just don't identify with them and take the step and start the conversation and remove the conditions also, which again are in mind. These conditions are in mind. They're beliefs, they're dichotomous beliefs. Remove the conditions that suggest if the conversation goes in this direction, then you have succeeded. You are magnetic. You are influential. And if it goes in this direction, you are not. Now, practically speaking, and interestingly enough, one might say, well, I would like to have influential conversations. I would like to be influential. And the interesting paradox is that if you release the conditions, what naturally manifests is flow-based harmonious conversations that are mutually harmonious, and it tends to go in a mutually harmonious favor. I taught this to sales professionals. I was in sales for many years as I did my own sales when I built my IT business, my consulting practice, etc. And I've also worked with sales teams, and I taught this to them. I said, of course, you genuinely desire to acquire the client, yet if we release these conditions that you need to try to control them, force, or manipulate them, rather accept yourself and allow what naturally arises to flow, the way you go about doing it, your style of how you go about doing it, let's say, which is true and authentic for you, naturally arises. This is true also for dating, romantic relationships, etc. As we release these unnecessary conditions in mind, what naturally arises is the appearances of mental influence, where people might, again, as I said, look at you and say, your style of communicating, the way you were communicating to that person, your body language, what you said, etc., that was why they appeared to be influenced by you. That's why they moved forward with that decision. That's why they accepted when you asked them out on the date, they said yes, because you did all these things. And I say, don't identify with those appearances. Maybe it works for a period of time, and then all of a sudden it doesn't work. And now they think there's something wrong with them because they formed an identity around those appearances. By releasing the conditions, pure being manifests as harmonious relationships. That is because reality is in harmony with you now as it is now. People, environment, circumstance, and information is in harmony with you now. Reality equals harmony. As we release these conditions in mind placed upon consciousness, which are unnecessary, as pure consciousness is perfect as it is, why else would we call it pure consciousness if it was not perfect as it is? And you are pure consciousness. You don't need to look for love, happiness, peace, bliss, fulfillment externally. You are love, happiness, peace, bliss, fulfillment. You are whole, you are complete, pure being. So you simply release these conditions. So during the conversation, for example, a person may ask the person out on a date, and they may say that they're not interested. That might present an opportunity. Let's say the individual asks another individual out on a date, and this individual says, no, they're not interested. Now this person may identify with an old man belief that suggests that this means not happiness. We can clearly see that that's a condition in mind placed upon consciousness. As that person releases that condition, by not identifying with the illusory thoughts, that if they identify with that illusory thoughts, they embody that belief and it plays out as an emotional and behavioral response to that belief. As they don't identify with that, they let the world be perfect as it is. They let themselves be perfect as they are. They let the other person be perfect as they are. And the relationship flows naturally from there. What I have seen is at times this person now says, maybe later on in the conversation, let's go on a date. Or later on, they somehow cross your path, you're walking around, and the conversation starts at that point without the confirmation bias of them resulting in unhappiness, or because of them you are unhappy. And at a particular point, you may end up dating, or you may not. Either way is totally fine, because at the end of the day, you meet someone that mirrors your being authentically. Have you noticed that this world that appears through the five senses from imagination plays out as theater to reflect your degree of self-acceptance? Have you noticed, and I have noticed this as well, as I've taken these opportunities to release these conditions placed upon consciousness, that it needs to be this way or that way, not looking to this world to suggest how I should do things, how I should not do things, rather listening to my intuition, listening to myself and trusting myself, as I have been doing this over the years, as these conditions were released from consciousness, which these conditions are beliefs in mind. What naturally occurs is, we could say, more harmonious business deals, more harmonious relationships. It's easier to start conversations with people. What I notice is that you meet people wherever you are out and about, and you share wonderful experiences. You meet new friends. If it's dating, for example, it's easier for you to start the conversation. The dates are more flow-based. All these things, we could say, are naturally added onto you, and they may appear to a third party looking at that as theater of wonderful mental influence. You seem to be very persuasive. You seem to be very influential, very charismatic. Yet, it is your style. So you don't need to look to this world and say, I need to copy this person's style of charisma or personal magnetism or influentialness. You can simply take these opportunities. Certainly, you can be inspired by people. Certainly, you can be inspired by people. What I recommend is going beyond the appearances, we could say, looking beyond the appearances and say, where does this appearance of what they say, what they don't say, do, don't do, naturally arise from? And with the individuals that demonstrate authentic personal magnetism, charisma, mental influence that is unconditional. In other words, they don't get offended, let's say, if things don't go their way. If it goes their way, great. If it doesn't go their way, great. It doesn't change the fact that they are fulfilled. I am fulfilled. Complete love, happiness, peace, bliss, fulfillment. You'll notice that. They flow and say things, and it looks very poetic, very artful, beautiful theater, we could say. You notice that if, let's say, people respond in this way or that way, regardless, they remain as they are. Pure being. Because whether they know it or not, because I've spoken to many people who didn't know that they were doing what we're talking about here consciously, yet they were doing it. They were releasing the conditions, which also I find naturally happens with salespeople. As I mentioned, I've worked with many salespeople. The ones that excel release these conditions. And what happens is when we have a conversation, they're like, oh yeah, I do. I remember doing this. I remember releasing these conditions one by one by one by one. And then what naturally arose was the sales numbers went up, etc. So I trust you'll notice that as well. If you look beyond what they do, what they say, beyond what they do, what they say, those that have accepted themselves as love, happiness, peace, bliss, fulfillment fully, or let's say to a high degree, you notice that, oh, what they do, what they don't do, what they say, what they don't say, voice tonality, body language, etc., naturally arises as they have accepted themselves. So now, to practically apply what we're talking about here, to manifest the appearances of mental influence, which even include what we can call the sixth sense based, or beyond what's visible through the five senses based, which again, visible through the five senses can be looked at as what to say, what not to say, body language, etc. Beyond that, the telepathy, the let's say, mind reading and all these interesting phenomena, sixth sense based, let's say, beyond the five senses based, to manifest all that, all these appearances of mental influence, of persuasion, naturally. We can call it mental influence, persuasion, and whatever you'd like to call it. Yet when a person is authentically being as they are, they're not concerned, we could say, about if they're being influential or thought transmission or telepathy. All these things happen naturally. All these things happen automatically. We can point to them and give them labels and describe them this way and that way. All these things flow naturally, and it just appears as a person being influential in a conversation. More accurately, what's happening is it's pure consciousness playing out as theater as two people get together or a group of people get together, and they're all in synchronicity, in harmony. That is the natural result of being. So again, being as you are, perfect as you are, whole, complete, as you acknowledge the self that is beyond belief, beyond limitations, which is you, that is you. Anything that appears to suggest that you are not the self beyond limitation are illusions that appear to disappear. So you have the opportunity to let them disappear, we could say, prior to conversations, during conversations, after conversations. You can simply not identify with those thoughts of limitation, and mind is purified. That's what they did. As we release these conditions in mind, we acknowledge pure consciousness, which is who we are beyond the conditions in mind. And then it naturally manifests as harmonious relationships, wonderful conversations, authentic flow, interacting with people. I trust you notice this. I tend to meet people more so today than ever before that show up saying the exact same thing that I have been imagining. And at times they say the same thing differently, and we reconcile that we're saying the same thing. We tend to have the same interests. We tend to have the same desires to do the same things without the unnecessary trying to convince, force, or manipulate the person, because reality is perfect now. So we're seeing reality the way it is, we could say, perfectly as it is now, and it is appearing that way as harmonious relationships. And even as mentioned, what a person can look at and say, oh, wow, you are both very magnetic, or you are very magnetic, and your style of communication is very persuasive. What you say, how you say it is, and they may, let's say, bring up their NLP or some kind of persuasion sheets or something like that and say, you check mark here, check mark here, check mark here. When in actuality, what's happening is that's all naturally arising, authentically. And at times, they may even notice, they may say, wait, something that you said, something that you did seems to violate this thing that says if you do that thing, then not magnetism, then not influence. I trust you've noticed this. You may have come across some information that suggests you should never do this thing, or you should not do this thing, because then the conversation won't flow, or they won't accept that when you ask them out on a date, they'll say no if you do this thing. Yet it naturally flowed out of you. You did the thing, and the date happened. They said yes. And not only did they say yes, they said, I really love that you said what you said. What they're pointing to is you have accepted yourself. So consider this. This entire world that appears to be made visible through the five senses from imagination is revealing our degree of self-acceptance. And pure consciousness is perfect as it is. You are perfect as you are now, as all the things you desire to be, which we could say are symbols of love, happiness, peace, bliss, fulfillment. So you simply release the conditions in mind that seem to suggest you need to do this or that in order to experience love, happiness, peace, bliss, fulfillment in this relationship, in the conversation. You release the conditions prior to interaction, during the interaction, after the interaction. As in after the interaction, you had a conversation with them. If it went this way, great. If it went that way, great. Continue to release these conditions. The old man might think, well, no, I really want it to go this way. It must go this way. Why would I want it to go this way? For the practice, release it and see what happens. That pure consciousness is perfect as it is. And as we release these conditions, which appear in mind, pure consciousness is experienced as harmonious relationships, which again, we can point to and say, that is magnificent theatrical demonstrations of personal magnetism, influence, etc. So I trust you found this video to be helpful. Let's conclude this with an auto-suggestion to further encourage. You could say, being as I am perfect now, all people, environment, circumstance, information appears to be in harmony with me as reality is perfect now, playing out pure consciousness as harmonious relationships, friendships, conversations, in a way that is true and authentic to me, manifesting as magnetic appearances, magnetic being, to reflect my degree of self-acceptance.